Okay, so on this video, I've recruited my unwilling housemate again.
Are we recording?
Yes, it's recording now. To have a conversation about this idea of research as a right and a battle. And this follows on a little bit from the last video we did where we talked about research paradigms, so different research paradigms. And all of this is sort of seen through the lens of... So, hi, Waylon.
Hi.
So all of this is sort of seen through the lens of a thing called action research, which is a way for practitioners, so, teachers, nurses, or really anybody who works in any kind of professional environment like that.
Stanley. Stanley.
Who's Stanley?
Marvel. Action movies.
Practitioners, I said?
Sure.
Oh, action research, I see. I'm going to edit that out because that was dumb.
That was funny.
If it was funny, I would keep it in there, but... Oh, I get it. We talked about Marvel a lot in the previous thing. Maybe I won't edit it out. Maybe it's not so bad.
You're the smart one in this conversation. God help us.
So, action research is a sort of an approach to research where people can look at their practice, think about ways that they can improve it, try it out, gather evidence, have a look at it, the evidence, theorize about why it did or did not work, and where to go from there. And it kind of came out of, the history of it comes out of some of the civil rights movements in the 1960s, where they saw this as a way for communities of people who, were... the language is so difficult to use here because I feel like oppressed is such a heavy thing, but do you know what I mean? Like disempowered, disadvantaged groups were able to, black rights groups in the United States, LGBT groups around the world, feminists, all that sort of stuff. It was a way to provide evidence and research to support those calls for rights, if you get my drift.
Right, so it's putting your research into action, or is the research
so action
from
research
the
is,
actions?
Action research is both studying, it's a sort of a cyclic process where you go, right, here is the situation, I'm going to do research on that, I'm going to then theorize how I can improve my practice in that environment, gather data when I try this new thing, use that data to inform what I do ongoing.
Right.
And that's to say that in the 1960s, people were going, action research. There are a whole lot of political movements around that time, but one of the ways to give those movements legitimacy, particularly up against these sort of big, powerful governments that had a monopoly on research, was to be able to do their own research. So action research is this sort of amazing tool that can be used by communities to speak back to power. That's sort of the political thing that sits behind it. But in professional context now, it's also just a way of people improving their practice. So they go, I want to improve what I'm doing. How do I do that?
Right.
But there's one of the things that we talk about in this course at the University of Sydney is the sort of the political, not the politics, but the sort of, I guess you'd say the politics that sits behind research generally speaking. So how does research operate in the world today? Not just as this, what you think of as capital R research being done for the knowledge industry, which would be universities, think tanks, consultancies like KPMG or EY or whatever it is. Why have we come to understand research as that sort of thing? Because when you hear the word research, what do you think of?
Think of uni academics.
Yeah. So the idea behind this was that research is something that can be, can be used by anybody. So there's this guy, Appadurai, who theorizes about globalisation. And when he's talking about research, he's sort of emphasizing a global context, a world of rapid change where markets, media, and migration have destabilized secure knowledge niches and have rapidly made it less possible for ordinary citizens to rely on knowledge from traditional, customary, or local sources. So if I were to say to you, for example, we think of a world of rapid change in markets and media and stuff. When we think about globalization, we think that markets now are global forces. You only have to look at the news to sort of see what's going on with Trump and Xi Jinping and all that sort of stuff to understand that what's buffeting Australia's economy is global forces. But Appadurai is also saying that trend towards globalization has destabilized our access to local knowledge. So if I say local knowledge, what kinds of things do you think of?
Like local news.
Sure. And what do we mean by local?
Australia.
Cool.
New South Wales, Sydney.
Yeah, okay. So the interesting thing is if someone says, oh, global knowledge, what is local, people drill down to like a national level. It's the same with if you go overseas, when people ask where you're from, you identify Australia first. And if they know Australia, you might say Sydney, you'll pick a capital city. Even if you were from, say, like when I was from the Central Coast, I would say I'm from Sydney.
Yeah.
Because people understand that. That's what happens with globalisation. We sort of get to this very vast planetary scale and it destroys the local. When we talk about local knowledge, we can mean things as local as your local community around here. So what do you think is easier to access, global or local knowledge?
I would probably say global.
Why?
I mean, it depends on what you mean by knowledge. Like, if you're talking all knowledge, then as soon as you walk out the door, it's local knowledge.
Sure. But if you think about like researched knowledge, stuff from universities is I mean, apart from the fact that it's paywalled, unless it's open access or whatever. But even then, you can still, using something like Google Scholar, find university-produced knowledge. You may not be able to access it, but you can find it.
Yeah.
Don't use Google Scholar. Start with a library. But I think with local research and local knowledge, like the classic for me is it's easier for any Australian to find out what is going on in the US government with Donald Trump and Twitter. It's easier to find out what's going on with Brexit in the UK than it is for you to find out what's happening on your local council. Where would you start?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Where would you start if you wanted to find out what's going on with local council? It's really hard. That information doesn't leak out as much.
Yeah, you'd probably have to go to their actual website.
Sure, you might have to go to the website, you dig through Twitter. It's not on the front page of every paper. So this is kind of Appadurai's point, that as markets and media have globalized in this massive way, and social media is a part of that as well, it's become so easy to get access to that knowledge that we lose touch with local knowledge. But also he talks about traditional and customary knowledge, which I think is sort of the cultural knowledges that get attached to life. And when you talk about traditional knowledges, you obviously in Australia, you would be thinking of things like Indigenous knowledges and Indigenous ways of thinking.
Right.
So as global economies have gotten bigger, it's harder for us to access local knowledge because we're so used to accessing global knowledge. So the second layer of this, I think, is that Appadurai sees research as being really connected. So not just, like I said before, to producing knowledge for the sake of the knowledge industry, but a capacity to aspire. So he sees research as being really important for particular communities to plan their future and to do that with data and analysis and reason sitting behind it, to create hopes and desires for what that future might look like, and to create strategies and pathways to achieving socially valuable goals. So Appadurai doesn't separate out the idea, like it's not abstract research for no purpose. It's research that's geared towards improving the human condition. And if you think of research as being connected to those sorts of values, if you take away that connection to local circumstance, it obviously feels really disempowering. Because how does an individual in a community feed into that global industry? I mean, you can go and get a job at your university and all that sort of stuff. But it sort of puts the stakes of transformation at this huge global scale and obliterates the idea that you can make a difference at a small local level with research, I think is what I sort of take from this.
Right. I wonder how this massive globalization of knowledge and the fact that it is easier to figure out what's happening overseas or in America or Europe affects what feels like a surge of nationalism.
Well, I mean, that's a really good question because I wonder if
the nationalism is an attempt to reverse this and bring it back to local, or hey, we're still here type of.
So I guess the interesting thing is like the specific context in which nationalism emerges. This is not the first time in history that nationalist movements like this have emerged.
Of course.
And people draw parallels all the time. I think it's really dangerous to do it, to draw parallels between like, what's happening now in the world and what happened before, say, World War II. Or even World War One, but to a lesser extent World War One, because I think there's a whole lot of crazy stuff that was going on at the end of Empire. I think World War Two is a reasonable parallel, sort of authoritarian figures, strongmen, and so on. But I don't know that, context matters hugely. And we live in a very different world. What is different this time, and what I think is interesting about what you just said, is a character like Steve Bannon, who was Trump's advisor, who sort of led him into office. But where Trump is this kind of guy who just I don't even know what he believes. Do you know what I mean? I know he says these things.
I don't think he does.
Yeah, and Lenore Taylor had a really interesting article in The Guardian on the weekend where she said, as an editor, so we've got a lot of Australian journalists in the United States at the moment, and she said, as an editor of a newspaper, she'd never understood how much effort goes in American press to shaping what Trump says and making it coherent. She's like, because actually he is so, just all over the shop, that to give structure to what he is saying so that it's reportable requires such massaging of his words. So Trump is one thing, whatever. He's a product of this globalized movement, maybe. Steve Bannon is a very intelligent man, and Bannon's like, we are a global nativist movement or nationalist movement, and we're going to bring back this sort of, idea of this sort of populist, cultural nationalism into different countries. But it's a global movement. So unlike nationalism last time, which was purely a national movement, he's trying to create this globalized nationalism, which is this weird contradiction. So he's creating a globalized nationalist movement.
Right.
But it's also why you have characters like the Christchurch shooter, who, and the forums that he runs in, where they can seem incredibly racist. And they are, do you know what I mean? White supremacists and all this sort of stuff. But they will align with Hindu nationalists in India, because it's this idea that you have your own culture, you stick to it. So it's a global movement of people.
They share an ideology.
Yeah.
Right.
So I think it's interesting. So there's that. There's these big global movements and these sort of ideological movements that transmit around the world. How does research play out in that space? Number one is, I think that social media is forcing us, mass media generally, and this has been the case and accelerating for 80, 90, 100 years, that mass media is forcing us to think globally, because markets are globalized, markets are bigger if they're global, and we lose the capability to sort of communicate and research and plan and engage locally. Now, maybe this is why, and I'm totally theorizing here and it's a little bit off the thing, but I think this is an interesting conversation. Maybe part of what is happening with these radicalized young men is the fact that the internet sucks people out of that local context and pushes them into this sort of disconnected global world where you can connect with these fundamentalist extremist movements around the world of varying hues.
Yeah, I think that lack of connection is absolutely part of it.
So
on all levels, whether it's on the global level or whether it's on the local level, but I mean, obviously the local level is going to affect them more because that's the day-to-day. But if they then disconnect from that into that global world, I guess, then yeah, there's a lot more other things that they can connect to.
A lot of the research about countering radicalism, like radical extremism in particular communities, seems to emphasize the importance of the local and local community. So I guess that's another, if we sort of tie it back to this idea of your capacity to aspire, because we sort of move beyond that, there is both that idea that if we want to improve our local communities, one way to do that is through our capacity to organise, to research, to understand our local context. Maybe if we're trying to address particular problems like this, antisocial problems, it's about understanding what are the local factors that bleed into this horrifying situation that we've got. So I guess, yeah, there are globalized problems, and there are problems that come from like globalization because people feel, because it does, at the same time as the internet has made it easier and easier for governments to identify you as an individual and to target you, and for corporations to target you with advertising. At the same time, your individualism is kind of annihilated by the fact that you're just sort of pushed into this 7 billion strong world network.
Right.
One of the ways to restore a sense of community and community capability and the virtues of the local is to think about our capacity to aspire through research. So this is Appadurai's point. He sees research as a human right. So the capacity to document, to inquire into the world, to analyse, to communicate results has a powerful effect on a community's capacity to speak up as active citizens on matters that are shaping their city and their world. What happens to you in your life, in your day-to-day life, is so strongly affected by, I mean, if you look at levels of government in Australia, the federal government it controls tax in this country and the distribution of money. But if you really want to have a look at services that impact your life, it's the state government and local government that makes the difference. This sense of community in anywhere in Australia is actually set by local councils. People don't realise the extent to which, anymore, people don't realise the extent to which local councils shape our lives, right? And our local communities do, and our engagement with our friends and stuff. So I think that this is a really interesting concept, the idea of research as a human right, because we sort of go, I'm just going to, like everything, I'm just going to, not offshore, what's the expression? I'm just going to outsource research to universities or think tanks, the Grattan Institute. I'll get all those consultancies to take care of the research for me. I am just a person who just wants to go about their life. Now, that's fine. You can be a person going about your life as well, of course. Right. But, it would be nice to sort of... I do like the idea that Appadurai tries to renovate research as something that we can be empowered in our day-to-day lives to improve the situation around us. So he sort of sets this up. He makes the point, and we've kind of touched on this in a sense already, but he notes that research is a battle. He says that research-produced knowledge is everywhere, and it's doing battle with other kinds of knowledge, produced by personal testimony, the big one these days, opinion, revelation, or rumour, and also with other pieces of research-produced knowledge. So research itself is in tension with other types of research that are out there. We looked at paradigms in a previous video, and that is that, someone who approaches a particular social problem with a positivist paradigm, that there is particular ways of understanding problems in the world, and we can understand them absolutely with more and more research versus, say, a post-structuralist or, someone who's approaching a problem with an ethnography who might say, we can never have absolute rules for a scenario, but we can perhaps understand how people feel in this particular context. So there's research-produced knowledges combating each other, but at the same time, research-produced knowledge, so things like the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is, I think, a UN body, which sort of collates and aggregates climate change research to give you an authoritative picture of what is happening with climate change. They produce all this research-produced knowledge, and then you have someone like Tony Abbott come along and say climate change is probably doing good if it's happening. And he says stuff like, what did he say last year? Global warming action is the equivalent of killing goats to appease the volcano gods. It's kind of like a funny inverse of King Julian's, like, I need to throw someone into the volcano.
Yeah, another sacrifice.
The friendly gods eat it up. My sacrifice. So obviously what Tony Abbott's throwing out there is, partly it's opinion, partly it's rumour. It's really hard to describe what he does in this domain, but that's something that research-produced knowledge is up against. Charismatic figures, they call them charismatic because they influence people, but like people like Andrew Bolt articulate this anti-science thing. And it's like, these are the same people who defend Western civilization, but they condemn the sort of scientific method that came out of the Enlightenment that they defend.
Right.
So I'm just like, But anyway, research-produced knowledge is up against that. Just recently, you had Greta Thunberg giving her speech to the UN. Now, what she does is advocate really passionately for climate change science, the science of climate change. But at the same time as she does that, she's doing that through personal testimony, right? So it's, full credit to her, I agree with her. But we've got to recognize that at the same time as you've got the science, the research-produced knowledge telling its story, it is up against other types of knowledge, right? And in some cases, that knowledge is just as legitimate. Personal testimony is legitimate in other ways. It doesn't override the fact of climate change, but it inflects it. It helps us to understand it in different ways.
Right.
And that's politics, and that's the battle of research, right? It's up against political imperatives, it's up against personal imperatives, it's up against,
Idiots.
cunning and Machiavellian scheming, and idiots as well. So I think what Appadurai, the point that he makes is that the battle needs to keep in mind the importance of locally produced knowledge, which is often narrative. So it means it tells stories about what life feels like, and which frequently exists in forms that aren't recognized in traditional research. So if we think of traditional research as like, university, randomized controlled trials, field studies, all this sort of stuff, what locally produced knowledge looks like, the kind of knowledge that people produce in their everyday interactions, in their communities, in their homes, the sorts of knowledge that comes out of that and tacit understandings of a culture don't get recognized by knowledge industry research. But it is a kind of research. And I think action research is a way to sort of draw that out, to acknowledge it and draw it out. And then there's the other side of it, which is that a lot of research that gets done is European. It derived, right? It's the theory comes from Europe, or from the United States, from the Northern Hemisphere. So Raewyn Connell is a sociologist, a very famous Australian sociologist at UCID. She wrote a book, Southern Theory, which sort of looks to think about what kind of local understandings exist in the global south. So South America, Africa, Australia, and also the Middle East, India. And in some context, you would think of, the East. You would think of like China and Japan as well. But particularly the South, where I think because of colonization and what happened with European expansionism over a long period of time, they basically wrote these cultures off as being completely without value and having no sense of epistemology. So theory from what Raewyn Connell calls the metropole dominates our way of thinking about the world and what we value. What Southern Theory does, what the book Southern Theory does, and what, there's a really interesting scholar, Boaventura de Sousa Santos, who talks about epistemologies of the South. So actually new ways of understanding the world. I shouldn't say new. Very old ways of understanding the world.
New to us.
Yeah. New to Europeans. But sometimes it feels like it's going full circle, that there are actually knowledge systems that are respected, because, some Chinese and Japanese knowledge systems are super well respected by the academy, if not fully understood or appreciated, that actually reflect ideas that have been in Aboriginal culture in Australia for 60,000 years. Plus. You know what I mean? So I think the interesting thing about Southern Theory is that Connell calls this dirty theory. It's a play on words, but it's dirty as in the sense that it's rooted in the dirt from which it grows. Yeah. That context matters hugely in these cultures, and they help you to understand a particular context in a rich way. And I think if we were to give more credit to these Southern knowledges or these other epistemologies and other ways of understanding the world, we might be able to conceive some solutions to the problems that capitalism and Western knowledge has created. And that is sort of like massive industrialization, which is destroying the atmosphere. One way of thinking about this, and this is just one example of an Indigenous knowledge system. Several communities, I thought you were meant to like cough or something. No. Several Indigenous communities sort of look at how a knowledge system can holistically capture a whole person. And that is that knowledge is sort of embodied, but it's also actively deployed in life. That you can have traditional knowledge, which is intergenerational knowledge that flows into us from elders. Revealed knowledge, which is tacit understandings of the world that come from intuition and dreams. And empirical knowledge, which is knowledge that's grounded in actual aspects of day-to-day life. And I'm sure you could draw parallels between this and some sort of like Greek stuff, but I think the particular way that it's realized is quite beautiful. And it sort of suggests that your understanding of research and understanding of a knowledge system and an epistemology is inseparable to your identity as a spiritual, cultural, physical, political, economic, and social being.
It's all the same. It's like with like I say, bring it back to the Greeks. The gods were just part of life. It wasn't they're just a part of life.
And I guess there are some ways in which that does exist in some Western traditions, but in sort of scientific tradition and in the paradigms that we outlined last week, the spiritual thing and the holistic thing, the way it sort of contributes to your whole being, that is kind of diminished by our focus on a particular concept of research.
Right.